Hello, everyone. It's great to be doing our first shop talk of the year. We finally got to see each other today for the first time. And so I think most of you already know me. I'm Lynn Lancaster, the Mellon Humanities professor here at the Academy. And for anybody who's attending who may not have been to our shop talks in the past, let me just tell you how it's going to work. We have two speakers. We usually compare one artist with we combine one artist with one scholar. And tonight we have Carla Keyvanian and David Serlin. And each one will present about 25 minutes. And we'll then take questions for both speakers after they've both finished. And so you can let me know if you have a question by typing it into the chat. You can either say, I have a question, and I can call on you, and you can mute, and you can ask your question, or you can write the question and I'll do it for you. But please, when you put in the chat box, tell me who the question is directed towards. And it can be one or it can be both, but just let me know which one you want the question to go to. So our first speaker tonight is Carla Keyvanian. She's the National Endowment for the Humanities Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Postdoctoral Rome Prize in Renaissance and Early Modern Studies. And she's a scholar of Roman, late medieval, early modern architecture and urbanism. And her approach is that she really wants to understand the architectural phenomena within the broader context of Europe and the Mediterranean. A parallel and ongoing interest in methods of history writing has led her to publish on the architectural historian Manfredo Tafuri and his debt to Carlo Ginzburg's notions of microhistory. Her first book is called Hospitals and Urbanism in Rome, 1200 to 1500, and it was published by Brill in 2015. And it was actually reviewed in 3 different languages. She's now writing her second book, which focuses on the Hospital of Santo Spirito in Sassia near the Vatican. And Carla received a professional degree in architecture from the School of Architecture in Venice, and then her master's and PhD from MIT in the United States, where she studied history of art and architecture. She's currently professor in the School of Architecture at Auburn University, which is very close to my hometown, and runs the Rome program Study Abroad there. And her work has been supported, among others, by the Dibner Institute for Science and a 3-year Paul Mellon Fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study of the Visual Arts of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Today, she'll talk about her current project on the Hospital of Santo Spirito. Our second speaker is David Serlin. And David is the Arnold W. Brunner, Catherine Edwards Gordon, Francis Barker Tracy Rome Prize Fellow in Architecture. David is Associate Professor of Communication and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego, where he's an affiliated faculty in Critical Gender Studies, Urban Studies, and the interdisciplinary PhD program in Cognitive Science. So that gives you some idea of the breadth of David's interest. His research interests include architecture, urbanism, and the built environment, material culture and museum studies, and historical approaches to technology, disability, and the politics of design, among various other things. His single author works include Replaceable You, Engineering the Body in Post-War America, published by the University of Chicago in 2004. And that was awarded the inaugural Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize from the Modern Language Association. He has a book forthcoming, he has the greatest titles, called Window Shopping with Helen Keller, Architecture and Disability in Modern Culture, which will also be with the University of Chicago. And then in 2018, he published together with his husband, Brian Selznick, a beginning reader for kids 4 to 8 years old called Baby Monkey Private Eye, which is a New York Times bestseller. And today he will talk to us about his current project on the Progetto Ophelia, an early 20th century psychiatric hospital in Potenza, Italy. So you can see that this one does have sort of a hospital theme to it, which is probably appropriate given the conditions we're all living in at the moment. So we are going to start with Carla. And so I think Carla can share her screen with us now. Carla, unmute yourself. Oh, Carla can't unmute herself.
Ah, there I am.
Okay.
All right. I'll share my screen right away. Can you all see it and hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Lynn. My project, a book-length manuscript, started with the rather modest ambition to investigate a remarkable yet overlooked 15th century building whose architect is unknown, the Hospital of Santo Spirito in Sassia, located along the edge of the Tiber, immediately inside the Borgo, the walled citadel across the river from Rome proper, which also includes the Vatican. You see in the image the entire complex of the still operating hospital, and in darker red, the building I'm concerned with. And here you see it in an aerial view. Originally built around the year 1200 as the first public hospital in Rome, the infirmary was rebuilt by Pope Sixtus IV in the 1470s. I was alerted to the unnoticed architectural significance of the building while writing my previous book, Hospitals and Urbanism in Rome from 1200 to 1500. I traced in that book Rome's urban development over the 3 centuries that shaped the face of the city by viewing that development through the construction of public hospitals. Early hospitals were not the medical centers we think of today. They were essentially charitable institutions that housed the poor for typically 3 days before returning them to the streets. They did not have any lasting effect on the alleviation of poverty. The substantial expenditure these vast institutions entailed was justified instead by the political function they served as a visible manifestation of the charitable capacity of the ruler. Charitableness was deemed a necessary attribute of legitimate rulership since Mesopotamian times and is prescribed in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. At politically opportune moments, public displays of charity were transformed into tools of government across Europe and the Mediterranean. That explains the seemingly paradoxical fact that these shelters for the poor were monumental buildings with a distinguishing architecture and invariably built in prime urban locations. To enhance visibility, they were built by city gates or bridges, and especially on the main square of cities next to the cathedral. Santo Spirito checks all 3. It was built at the entrance of the Borgo, the walled citadel defended by Castel Sant'Angelo. It was oriented toward the bridge of Castel Sant'Angelo, then the only bridge linking the city to the Borgo, and stood on the road from the bridge to St. Peter's, the cathedral. Large hospitals, I argued, did not appear in Europe around the year 1200 in response to pandemics or demographic spikes that increased the number of the poor, as seems at first sight reasonable and has until now been the common assumption. Hospitals were built as urban expressions of sovereignty, demonstrations of good government that flourished at times of intensive state building to ballast fledgling dynasties or nascent national monarchies. Massive charitable institutions were tools of political persuasion that helped construct a virtuous public image for rulers, aiding in the formation of centralized administrations. Hospitals were born of the same throes that delivered the secular and papal monarchies of Europe, I concluded, and first appeared for that reason in France, Rome, and England, respectively. In Rome, identifying where hospitals were built and why such areas were considered strategic explains the reasons for the development of the city along certain trajectories. Hospitals, in fact, were built in areas their patrons wanted to develop, settle, and garrison, while at the same time ballasting their corporate image. The Hospital of Santo Spirito is a case in point. It was originally built around 1200 by Pope Innocent III, young, highly educated, and a visionary who expanded and consolidated the borders of the papal state. He understood the need for a permanent center of papal government and decided to establish it in the walled and eminently defensible Borgo. The construction of Santo Spirito at the entrance to the Borgo signals, I claimed, that intention. The Pope was the Bishop of Rome, and canonical law required that each bishop build next to the cathedral, his home church, a large hospital that displayed the judicious use of public funds, the donations reaped from the faithful. By building Santo Spirito next to St. Peter's, Innocent manifested his intention to definitively transform St. Peter's into his home church, the cathedral. The traditional cathedral of Rome was, and technically still is, St. John the Lateran in the south of the city. Closer to St. Peter's, Innocent built the Palatine Chapel that later became known as the Sistine Chapel. The chapel replicated the dimensions of Solomon's temple, symbolically transforming the Pope into a new Solomon and his walled citadel into a new Jerusalem. I argued that the construction of the hospital and the Palatine Chapel next to the cathedral indicate Innocent's intention to transform the walled Borgo into the permanent center of papal power, long before the Renaissance popes who are credited with that achievement. Not all of Pope Innocent's successors shared his vision, and during the 14th century, the seat of the papacy was transferred to Avignon in southern France altogether. When the popes returned to Rome in 1420, they often preferred to reign from their family palaces as they had done during long medieval centuries. It was Sixtus IV who definitively reestablished the Borgo as the papal headquarters. An admirer of Innocent, he understood his great predecessor's lesson and restored the two institutions that Innocent had built in the Borgo, the hospital and the chapel that took its name from him. He rebuilt the hospital into the Sistine Infirmary, the largest in Europe, and refurbished the Palatine Chapel, henceforth known as the Sistine Chapel, by commissioning a fresco cycle from the most important artists of the time, Sandro Botticelli and Pietro Perugino especially. You see it here as completed under Sixtus without the ceiling paintings by Michelangelo, which were added by Sixtus's nephew, Pope Julius II. Julius continued his uncle Sixtus's policies along what was evidently a plan. When he ordered the demolition of Old St. Peter's and the construction of a much grander basilica, completed the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's frescoes, and built a much bigger church for the hospital complex, he completed that plan. My point is that there was a line of continuity, a vision for the Borgo that started much earlier than we thought with Innocent, was resumed by the Renaissance popes, especially Sixtus, and completed by his nephew Julius. The hospital was integral to that vision for the Borgo and an indispensable element in understanding the development of Rome's center of government, as well as the consequent reorientation of the entire city toward that center. To return to our story and the Sistine Chapel under Sixtus, its frescoes represented by no mere coincidence the tenets of the theory of papal primacy. The hospital figured prominently. In a central scene, Perugino depicted Christ handing the symbolic keys to heaven and salvation to Peter. The popes claimed that they were the divinely preordained successors of Peter, and the keys were as good as handed to them. In a scene that forms an ideal couplet with this one, and which directly faced the papal throne, Botticelli depicted the brand new Sistine Infirmary. In the painting, the building represents or stands for Solomon's Temple. We know that because the two figures on top of it represent the biblical episode when the devil brought Christ atop the temple, encouraging him to throw himself down and be saved by angels if indeed he was the Son of God. In front of the infirmary/temple stands the Hebrew high priest, actually a portrait of Sixtus IV, who's ascertaining, as prescribed in Leviticus, that the young man standing in front of me has been cleansed from sins and therefore his disease, leprosy. The Pope claims that their Christ-given keys to salvation meant they were the only ones capable of cleansing the faithful from sin, and therefore its wages, disease. As spiritual and thus also physical healers, only the popes could keep Christendom on the path to salvation. They claimed, for that reason, ultimate authority over the whole of Christendom, both religious and secular rulers alike. For a pope, rather than a secular prince or king, building a vast institution of healing was not simply a prescribed act of charity. It was an act directly tied to claims of papal primacy over secular authority. Hence, the position of the hospital/temple at both the geometric and symbolic center of the painting facing the papal throne. The grandeur of the Sistine Infirmary matched papal ambitions. It is an immense hall in elegant brickwork, capped by towering octagonal dome and adorned with a portico running 130 meters along the street to St. Peter's. In the immense interior, a vast fresco cycle illustrating Sixtus's life wraps around the upper portion of the walls. It is the only fresco cycle in the city comparable in extension to the one the same Pope commissioned immediately afterwards for the Sistine Chapel. I have at this point pivoted back to my current project, a book that descends from the urban scale to an architectural one, focusing on this hospital alone. My argument is that the remarkable architecture of the infirmary served as a manifesto of humanist principles. The Renaissance philosophy that saw in geometric proportions and simple mathematical ratios a representation of the cosmos and man's place in it. The infirmary has been either overlooked or misread by modern architectural historians because it does not fit current expectations regarding Renaissance architecture. The octagonal dome, for example, harks back to the medieval and northern Italian tradition, as does the brickwork and the portico. On the other hand, the portico's arches are framed by an innovative decorative motif that fully belongs to the Renaissance's love for the revival of antiquity. The so-called theater motif, because it is modeled on the exterior of the Colosseum, but rendered here in brickwork. The motif appears in the hospital for the very first time in Rome, destined to enjoy widespread popularity in the future. This juxtaposition of traditional and vanguard elements has baffled modern scholars who have either suggested that designer was a minor, uneducated figure who sprinkled the traditional architecture he had learned in the course of a practical education on construction sites with a few fashionable motifs he picked up along the way, or that a presumably uncoordinated number of architects from various parts of Italy produced the building's perceived eclecticism. Rather than the supposedly eclectic architecture, what I found to be actually perplexing is that Sixtus, who presided over one of the artistically and intellectually richest courts of all times, and who for the decoration of his Sistine Chapel had maneuvered to get into Rome the most important painters of the time from rival Florence, would commission the construction of the largest hospital in Europe, an institution central to his urban and political project, depicted prominently in the Sistine Chapel, from some run-of-the-mill professional or an uncoordinated bunch of such professionals. The starting argument of my book is that the architect of the Sistine Infirmary was actually Giovanni Giocondo da Verona, more commonly known as Fra Giocondo, meaning Friar Giocondo, because, like Sixtus, he was a Franciscan friar. Fra Giocondo was one of the three most important architect engineers of his generation, summoned to Naples for the restoration of fortification systems, to Paris for the construction of the bridge of Notre Dame, and to Venice for the Rialto Bridge. He flanked Bramante and supervised Raphael on the construction site for the new Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome under Julius II, then the most important project in Europe. Most extraordinarily, he was, in addition, a classicist of the highest caliber. He edited with a new philological, that is to say, modern analytical approach, a collection of epistles by Pliny the Younger he himself had discovered in Paris, codices by Sallust and Nonius Marcellus, and the first illustrated edition of Vitruvius, which influenced generations of Renaissance architects and beyond. He was a native of Verona in northern Italy and must have studied in nearby Padua, then the foremost center for the study of the classics. In the same years as Sixtus, a fellow Franciscan, was first a student and then a celebrated lecturer in that city. The two learned Franciscans had ample opportunity to establish a rapport based on mutual admiration. When Sixtus became Pope, is my working hypothesis, he summoned to Rome for the construction of his great hospital the trusted and talented co-religionist he had known since his youth. My research has accumulated much circumstantial evidence, but a decisive piece of archival documentary proof has thus far eluded me. Part of my time here in Rome will be devoted to continuing archival research, but the sort of document that would prove decisive, a piece of paper to the effect that Fra Giocondo was paid, say, a certain sum for the design of the hospital, might not have survived or even existed in the first place. That forced a reflection on the validity of alternative sources of evidence, starting with the architecture. This project became, in part, a test for the evidentiary value of architecture. It turns out there was much unequivocal evidence that the architecture could provide. A close reading of the architecture, illustrated in a set of drawings produced by a talented former student, revealed a unique series of correspondences between the structural and ornamental schemes, the interior and the exterior, the architecture and the murals. The exterior ornamental pilasters, as these elements are called, which represent fictive square columns embedded in the wall, correspond in the interior to the actual ceiling beams that they thus appear to support, with a clear structural logic. In the interior, the ceiling beams appear instead to be supported by the trompe-l'oeil painted columns that separate the fresco scenes, i.e., the fictive square columns embedded in the wall are represented by pilaster strips on the exterior and trompe-l'oeil painted columns in the interior. That also means that each fresco scene is nestled within the architectural bay marked by pilasters on the exterior and the structural bay of the timber trusses in the interior. The whole interlocking system, an absolutely unique system, is further governed by a framework of geometric and mathematical ratios that ties together all three dimensions of the building. Because its section is a perfect square, that is to say, its height is identical to its width. This integrated and interlocking system, unparalleled in any other building I know of, cannot be appreciated by any single viewing point. Visual spectacle is negated in favor of a cerebral, mathematically rigorous approach to architecture. So much so that it has thus far gone undetected. The identification of this governing system for the architecture dismisses earlier hypotheses about the designer being some anonymous professional, a klutz, or a series of such klutzes. The relentlessly coherent system could only have been produced by a single individual and one that was exceptionally talented. The architecture further reveals his provenance. The tower dome on squinches, as these elements are known, is uncommon. It's an uncommon structural system. Domes on squinches originated in Persia and arrived in northern Italy, especially in the Veneto and Lombardy, probably by way of Armenia during the Crusades. In the Roman hospital, the 8-sided dome raised on 4 arches, a system as potent as it is simple, most closely resembles the dome of the old Cathedral of Verona. The portico is modeled instead on that of the recently completed Franciscan Hospital in Padua, an institution sixes would have known well as well. As for the trompe-l'oeil columns appearing to hold up ceiling beams, there is only one precedent. The immense hall of the Palazzo della Ragione, also in Padua, frescoed by Giotto. All of these elements coming from either Padua or Verona indicate somebody who had close ties with these cities. The architect of the Sistine Infirmary was thus someone with a humanist appreciation for proportional systems and mathematical rigor, and an engineer's talent for structural logic, who hailed from the Veneto region, where Verona and Padua are located, and who was in Rome during the 1470s. That dramatically narrows the number of individuals who fit the bill. At a minimum, this study will bring attention to this building, nuancing in the process our understanding of Renaissance architecture. If my attribution of the design to Fra Giocondo proves convincing, it will also set the cornerstone for the reconstruction of Fra Giocondo's architectural oeuvre. For all of his acclaim among contemporaries, in fact, and the recent resurgence of studies on Fra Giocondo, no building yet remains securely attached to him. Far from being the outcome of a pastiche, I will argue, the hospital architecture represented a new philological understanding of the historical past, both medieval and ancient, integrated into a spatial and proportional system that amounted to a conceptual framework. Fra Giocondo belonged to the new humanist breed of antiquarians, as they were called. Rather than limiting themselves to reading the political history illustrated in ancient texts, these were individuals who searched for evidence in the material remains of antiquity, inscriptions, coins, and especially architecture, in order to reconstruct the cultural history of antiquity. Antiquarians established the basis for the modern notion of history based on material rather than only textual sources, governed by a philological approach and preoccupied with the reconstruction of cultural and material history. Highly educated architects joined their ranks during this period, which witnessed the emergence of the new figure of the architect/intellectual. And that is because they leverage their ability to read both the ancient texts and the physical architectural remains of antiquity. If an architect antiquarian such as Fra Giocondo did indeed design the Hospital of Santo Spirito, its architecture might stand at the crux of that newfound understanding about history writing and the role of architectural design during a time when the foundations of these two disciplines intersected for a brief and unparalleled moment. This broader hypothesis is the newest part of my project, newest and most tentative part of my project. I hope that by the end of my stay here, it will have bases as solid as those of the Santo Spirito Dome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Awesome.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much.
So we're going to turn to David now, who is going to share his screen.
I am indeed.
Okay.
A second here. Okay. Okay, how's that?
That looks good.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Carla. Among other things, you've not only given a fantastic presentation about the specific building, but you've also set up a lot of the themes that I want to talk about in my presentation, even though I'm dealing with something, about 500 years later. Also, before I begin, I just want to thank the Academy for giving me this incredible opportunity. Today, I went to my studio, and I think I'm using the British expression gobsmacked correctly when I say that I was overwhelmed by how beautiful the studio is. So I really can't wait to use it to begin really getting deep into my project. So the title of my talk today is called Discovering the Progetto Ophelia, and I want to emphasize the word discovering because I am at the very beginning of a project to look at this very particular site, which is in Potenza. So when I say discovering, I really do mean that I am beginning that process of uncovering it and trying to figure out what I want to do and how I want to situate it within the broader themes or concerns of my work. Here is an illustration of the Progetto Ophelia, which obviously in Italian means the Ophelia Project. And it was designed as a manicomio provinciale, which literally means a provincial mental asylum or institution. I think the word, unless I'm mistaken, the word manicomio can mean asylum for those with mental illness, but with provinciale, it can be an asylum. And it is in Potenza. And for those of you who, like me, are newish to Italy, the city of Potenza is all the way east. I'm told it's about 4.5 hours by train from Rome. So it's quite a distance from Rome, but also even from Western cities like Naples. And the Progetto Ophelia was designed by Marcello Piacentini. More about him in just a moment, but I want you to get a sense of the campus of this particular institution, and if it looks like a college campus, or it looks maybe like an industrial park of some kind, or something other than a mental institution, that's part of what makes me want to study it further. Here is the man, Marcello Piacentini, and a copy of a newspaper from the area from about 1906 announcing that Il Manicomio Provinciale in Potenza was built and ready to have patients there. I thought for my presentation, rather than talking about the project in depth, what I would do is tell you a little bit how I came to find this particular site and what it is that interests me about it, which I will obviously share with you as my talk goes on. I just finished a book that Lynn had mentioned at the beginning of our session today called Window Shopping with Helen Keller, Architecture and Disability in Modern Culture. This is a book that's forthcoming with Chicago, and a good friend of Brian and mine, Peter Mendelsohn, designed the cover. And I don't know how clear it is from the image I'm sharing with you, but there is a series of embossed dots that are in the shape of the Eiffel Tower. And actually, when the book is published, those will be Braille, and they'll give the information of the title, author, the press. And the book is an attempt to understand how people with kind of different ways, sensory impairments, or different ways of experiencing the world, how they engage with architecture. And it started about 20 years ago when I found this photo in an archive. It's a photo of Helen Keller on the left with her secretary, Polly Thompson, window shopping on the Champs-Élysées. Now, if that sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, it's not a joke at all. In fact, she was a very committed window shopper, but the way in which she window shopped was that she would go with a friend or companion, secretary, and stand in front of a window, and the secretary would tell her what was in the window, and they would communicate through signing into each other's hand. So there's a very interesting experience that's going on here where she is experiencing the window shopping. She also writes in her diary about moving through Paris or London or New York and smelling tobacco and smelling perfume and standing on the metro platform in Paris and feeling the vibration of trains. And so what it made me realize is that the attention, even over-determined attention that we often give into sight and hearing in terms of architecture and urban experience, could be expanded in interesting ways. And so I began to investigate and explore different case studies that allowed me to think about this relationship between people with certain forms of bodily or sensory differences and the worlds in which they travel. For the purposes of my talk, but also some of the things that inspired the presentation that I'm giving today about projectophilia, I wanted to share some concepts with you that are very important to me. The first is what I and other people who have been looking at these instances called architectural empathy, which is a deliberate approach to the users of architecture that are attuned empathically to bodily difference, which is another way of saying architects or designers who use difference as an inspiration, not as something to fix or avoid. The idea that architectural empathy could be linked to what some are calling sensory design. Again, a deliberate approach that relies on designing for existing senses as opposed to designing for compensation for loss. The idea that you could design spaces that rely on smell or touch or don't insist on certain kinds of visual or even physical ways of moving through the built environment as a design inspiration, as opposed to something to kind of avoid or get around somehow. And then the last one is more of a kind of methodological or philosophical approach, which is that I'm very taken by the idea of genealogy when we think about space. Very inspired by the work of Michel Foucault, who borrows and adapts it from Nietzsche. And this is idea that when we talk about histories of places, what we're often trying to do is avoid saying that this is the history of a place, but instead thinking about the fact that there are multiple histories going on and that history flows in different directions. Thinking about genealogy like a family tree, where I am the grandson of my grandfather, but my grandfather was the great-grandson of his own grandfather, and that time moves in lots of different ways at the same time, that histories are stochastic and not linear. is something that has been inspiring to me. And so thinking about the histories of the senses in relation to architecture kind of works best when thinking about things that flow in lots of directions simultaneously. Sensory design is not a new idea. Any of you who have traveled in parts of the world where you have seen or experienced this, this is a curb cut which features a rubber mat that has been installed. The rubber mat comes out of the disability rights movement of the late 60s, early 70s that insisted that there be ways for people who are visually impaired to be able to move between, let's say, a sidewalk and a curb. And so that's why you get those raised bumps. That's why it's often in a contrasting color like a red or a bright neon yellow. And it also functions as a transition point. So whether you're using a cane to move from one space to another, or perhaps you are pushing a baby stroller, or perhaps you are jogging, or you're talking on your phone and you don't have the time to look down where you're going, it functions in lots of different ways to give kind of sensory information below your feet or below your white cane to let you know that you're making a transition. That is one way of thinking about sensory design. But that's a contemporary example. There are lots of other ways of thinking about sensory design, or a kind of empathic design that thinks about, for example, someone who might be in bed, like this woman who would like to play her piano, but unfortunately is unable to get out of bed. And so here is a design innovation which just turns a piano horizontal into vertical. And those are the kinds of sort of, I wouldn't say easy, but kind of ingenious solutions, we might say, to certain kinds of design problems that are part of the world, the built environment and the design worlds that we occupy. That's also true of features that enable people to experience objects that otherwise would be visually oriented, but instead using tactile senses. This is a photo that I like very much from the collections of the American Museum of Natural History of blind children from the New York City public school system around 1910 being encouraged to go up to a globe and use it as a way of understanding where they are. And of course, there would be a teacher nearby to help instruct them. Tactile or information or tactile design is actually very complex, has a very complex history. So while there is something like this that we could say is educational and enables people to experience the world in certain ways that they might otherwise not, this is an example of a different way of thinking about tactile design. This is something that is known as the tavola tattile, or otherwise known as Sudan Parigi, that was designed by the futurist Marinetti. His idea was that among his other futurist kind of manifestos, that tactility would be one way of educating people in the future. And so this is a table, of an overview of a table, and going from right to left, we have silk, brocade, velvet, which represents Paris. And then we have on the very far side a bits of cork and different kind of tactile textures, some seaweed, and that represents Sudan. And his idea being that a luxurious tactile feel would tell you about Paris, and something that was kind of rough and more primitive would tell you about Africa. Marinetti, I guess, maybe in a nutshell of sorts. At any rate, tactility doesn't necessarily have one direction in terms of the way that we understand it and incorporate it into sensory design. It actually goes in multiple directions, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting. A couple of other examples that I draw upon in my book. This is a building that has since been demolished that was designed for children who use wheelchairs or mobility impairments in Denver. And it has or had the striking feature of having no staircases there were only these amazing sort of double ramps that went in both directions that were used by everyone to kind of make it possible for people not only get up and down, but also to kind of centralize their experiences and not to have it as something in the back. You'll note, by the way, that these were designed in the 1930s, long before the kinds of the ideas about access and accommodation that are so much more familiar to us, certainly in the US and other parts of the world that have been around since the 1980s and 1990s. This is a kind of empathic design that long precedes those ideas. I've also written about this building that has been repurposed, but it still stands in Chicago. It was designed as a regional library for the blind by the great Chicago architect Stanley Tigerman. And it was designed as a library both for people who use wheelchairs as well as people who are blind or have visual impairment. My favorite part of this design, which since has been demolished, is that Stanley Tigerman designed a children's reading section with these little tunnels, knowing that children who are blind or have visual impairment wouldn't necessarily need to have light around, so they could crawl into these tunnels and hide away from their parents and teachers. It was this, again, a kind of attunement to the kind of naughtiness of experience that they might not otherwise have because of the prying eyes of parents who were really kind of worried about them, but here they get to kind of have their own experiences. Finally, this is a building that some of you may have seen before. It's a design at Gallaudet University, kind of first university for the blind, mandated by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. And the design feature here is that since it is a space predominantly by deaf or hard of hearing students, the sight lines for the space all rely on visual cues so that you can communicate by sign language if you're down here sitting with people who are up in these various mezzanines, or with the knowledge that people who are deaf like to kind of sit in circular or semicircular arrangements so they can communicate with each other. That's all built in. And the architect designed this space very much in consultation with deaf people. So it's a really good example of kind of sensory or empathic design choices. Okay. Just to kind of bring us into the realm of the hospital, this is a chair that many of you have maybe sat in before or know about. This is a chair that was designed by Alvar Aalto and was and remains an icon of a certain kind of early 20th century design. But many people don't know that it was actually designed for a sanitarium for people with tuberculosis in Finland. And this was a kind of very innovative hospital design that really relied not only on this furniture to kind of open up the chest and help with breathing, but also was permeated with light and air in the spirit in the early 20th century of helping patients through kind of natural means, like free-flowing air and sunlight. That's the exterior of the Paimio Sanitarium. Which brings us to the Progetto Ophelia. And I found out about the Progetto Ophelia while I was researching my book and many of the examples. And the thing that really captivated me about it is that it was a design that was very much ahead of its time, because if you have ever seen, not the kind of hospitals that Carla was talking about, but later on, hospitals in cities like this one in northern Italy that were very much modeled on institutional architecture where everything is kind of crammed together in one space. The circle that I have on the right side of the slide is the original building, which is shown here on the left side of the slide. And these designs kind of kept everything together in one space. And that was in Italy and in most parts of the world, the way that hospital architecture for people with mental illness or asylum architecture was made. The innovation that Piacentini kind of came up with was to think less about it as one building that would concentrate everyone together, and to think about the way that design could, of the campus itself, but also the way that the design of individual buildings and features within buildings could be kind of inspired by new emerging ideas by psychologists, or the discipline of psychology as it was emerging from people like Freud in the late 19th, early 20th century, and also the kind of sensory effects that could be produced. I have annotated this so that you can see what was written in the original Italian. The campus itself has certain very conventional features. It's divided in half, women on the left side, men on the right side, and you can read how each one of these buildings is dedicated to particular populations, from the agitati e furiosi, which sounds like a level from Dante's Inferno. And then as you move closer to the administration building, things get a little bit more calm. I hope I've translated sudici e epiletici correctly. An Italian friend of ours says that sudici can also be translated as indecent or immoral. Maybe that was the way it was used in 1905. But at any rate, as you move closer and closer to the central administrative buildings here, the buildings get less agitati and furiosi. The thing that's so interesting about Piacentini's design is that in different sections, for example, here in the agitati e furiosi for women and for men, he designed courtyards that were specifically made for patients that would use light and air with the intention of helping to calm down their violent or angry tendencies, which was the language of the time. But there were also these interior spaces that would be infused with certain kinds of smell or certain sounds, or would use light in particular ways that would then be kind of used as an adjunct to the hospital's newly emerging language of psychoanalysis, and also a certain kind of care that Piacentini understood as a young man would really help, or were imagined to help, the patients who were there. And those kinds of spaces, which are still part of the architecture of these buildings, I'm very curious to know what they are like now, because, as I'll say in just a moment, the campus itself doesn't function like a manicomio anymore. It actually has morphed into something else. The other part of the campus that I just want to point out is this part over here that's separated out, the contagiosi, obviously the contagious, and it harkens back to something that Carla was describing, which is that many of these that we would call hospital or asylums, they functioned to segregate people from the community and also even from other patients. And there was a kind of way that they showed off the kind of charitable work of the province, or charitable work of those who were in power. They were civic institutions as much as they were institutions of care. And that's obviously clear in the kind of geographical location of the Santa Spiritu that Carla described. But I think that's also reflected in much of what we're seeing here in the arrangement of buildings on the campus of the Progetto Ophelia. Here are some photographs during the construction of some of the buildings, and you can see the way that they are designed to look more like residential complexes than what we would identify as hospital design. There really was nothing quite like this, certainly in Italy, and I would argue that it really isn't until the 1920s and 1930s that you get architecture that is meant to be kind of provincial asylum architecture that looks anything like this. Well, what happened to the Progetto Ophelia? Well, by the 1930s, it was converted into something called the Covo Dei or Dei. I'm still getting my pronunciation right. Arditi, sort of the Cove of the Artists. And it became an administrative building for Mussolini out in Potenza. And this area here, which was originally a railway entrance and also one of the hallways through which many people would be walking and have these kind of sensory experiences. It was renamed the Piazza Vittorio Veneto. This is a postcard from about 1932. Some of the buildings have been turned into apartments. Some of the buildings have been reclaimed by people in the area, but there's a vast number of them, including the entrance that remains completely in ruins and boarded up. And there's, although there have been attempts over the years to try to reimagine, repurpose what the space could be, this is an example of one that is holding certain kinds of secrets. And the secrets, of course, remain interesting for me as someone who wants to write about Piacentini, because as most of you know, or many of you know, Piacentini went on to become the handmaiden of fascist architecture, working with Mussolini to design iconic fascist buildings all over Italy, and especially ones like this, the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana in Rome. So one question that I have is, what happened? How does someone who seems to have such an attunement to the experiences of people and imagining architectural innovations or interventions that might assist in or help think about the psyche or think about one's own individual journey? How does someone with a particular kind of attunement become an architect of the fascist state? So that's one part of the study that I'm doing, along with really getting an opportunity to go there and see what is going on in this particular site. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm really curious to see what some of you make of the connections that I've been trying to draw upon and those that Carla and I tried to put out there with regard to hospital architecture. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Wow, another one gives us lots of stuff to chew on there. So at this point, let me just remind you that you can use the chat function to put questions in. And let me just find the chat. Okay. Yeah, so I have some questions. Katie Balch asked, should I type my question here for you to read, or should I read it? If you would just type in and say, I have a question for so-and-so, and then I'll call on you so that we're like not talking over each other. So that was a good question, Katie. So Katie, what is your question? Can you yeah. Okay.
Well, my first question was answered. Thank you, Lynn.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, thanks both of you. Those were both so interesting. My question for David is, I was wondering what the population of the campus was when it was occupied, and I was also curious if like part of your project is seeking out any primary sources of either employees or patients of the hospital, and if you found anything about that, or if that's something that interests you, or yeah.
Oh, David, you're muted.
Thanks, Katie. Well, I'll answer them in reverse order. The first part is that, as far as I know, the city records of Potenza and a lot of the kind of administrative and architectural collections where this would be featured are in Potenza. And so I have to make my way out to an area which, as far as I know, is a red zone, not an orange zone. So I won't be going there anytime soon. There is very little that I've discovered that's been written about this building, because anyone who has written about Piacentini tends to go for the meaty stuff and not look at this early work. I mean, he was just a young man fresh out of architecture school. So as far as I know, the papers of Piacentini have very little about this. So I really do need to go to the records. As far as employees, staff, doctors, patients, I'm really not sure. And as far as I can tell from in its heyday, if you want to call it that, this asylum had, as many as, I think, 600-700 people in it. And some of them were there kind of in a contained way, and some of them were kind of coming in and out depending on what was happening. We also have to imagine that, or know that in an earlier stage of medical history, people who had epilepsy, people who had kind of cardiac issues, people who had asthma, they were often medicalized in a much more severe way. So, they would be placed in homes to be taken care of, because the idea was that they couldn't be left on their own. Things that we think of as kind of chronic conditions now were seen as really serious medical conditions. So you would have the agitati and furiosi out there, and they might be permanent, but you might have someone who was dealing with a particular kind of issue kind of coming in or out, depending on what they were experiencing at the time. So that's what I would say is about the population. And then I am really curious to see what I can find that's in the archival record.
Thanks, David. Okay, I've got a few questions here. So first one is for Elizabeth Rodini, who has one for Carla, and then after that we'll go to Maggie.
Okay, hi, thank you. This is so great, and I'm so excited to have these start. And your talks were really interesting. I have a question for Carla that I think comes in part from listening to David, and in part just by curiosity about the space. And also, I have to say, when I was a graduate student, I proposed this dissertation topic on charitable public housing in Venice that I never realized. So I was thinking about kind of the uses of these spaces. And I was wondering, Carla, if you could say a little more about that. I guess you're calling it the infirmary, that big room, and how it was articulated. Was there furniture in it? Was it divided up? Was there any privacy? And were people just sleeping there? Who were these people, and what happened for these 3 days when they were in the hospital? And then, were they fed and then just let out again? Or can you just give us a little more sense of how the space was used? She can't unmute herself. I think.
Here I am.
Okay.
Yes, actually, the Santo Spirito in particular, Santo Spirito was the richest landholder in the city, by the way. They were enormously powerful. They had enormous possessions because it was a money-making machine also for the papacy. It also became the first bank in Rome. There used to be the Banco di Santo Spirito that was established in 1605. It existed until a short while ago before it merged with the Banco di Roma. But I mean, they were this enormous machine that accumulated resources that were very savvily, managed in a very sophisticated way. And they served as bankers for the papacy in numerous occasions. So what they also did was, so it also has a rich archive, and in this archive it includes lavishly illustrated codices about how the patients were to be treated, and they're illustrated in miniatures. It seems they also actively went around the city looking for the poor and brought them into the hospital. In this huge building, one of the reasons, of course, why the building is so huge is because they believed that the heat or vapors in summer caused pestilence. So it's so huge and freezing. It must have been absolutely freezing to avoid fevers in summer that were more dangerous than chills in winter. So there was some sort of medical attention. It was heated with braziers along the middle, which must have done very little. The patients had zero privacy, at least in this early stages. In the 1700s, that started changing because they built, on the model of French hospitals, little wooden like cabinets around the beds. But in this early period, the beds were just perpendicularly aligned along the walls. Tables were set up along the middle for them to eat. And they were bathed, which was important. There's all these instructions about how you're supposed to boil the linens and then use the hot water also to bathe the patients and wash their hair. There's detailed instructions. They were first bathed and then confessed and then received communion, and then they were placed in bed for 3 days and fed. Now, the hospital, we need to realize that this was a chronically undernourished population. So the hospital actually seemed to have an almost magical quality because 3 days of bed rest, hygiene, and food at regular intervals just, made miracles. So that increased the reputation of this and other hospitals as very beneficial. And of course, the Pope casting his beneficial aura over it, that was all part of what these hospitals meant. But one last thing that at first I'd included is also that when this was built, if you look at the hospital from across the river now, it's completely dwarfed by St. Peter's and the modern buildings that were raised. But back then it towered over the surroundings. And before the Sistine Chapel was refurbished, and while the Vatican Palace was still, had been built piecemeal, this was the most ceremonial representational place available to the Pope, who received visiting dignitaries there among the beds, lined along the bed. So we know that he received Queen Charlotte of Cyprus, and that's also depicted in the frescoes, a number of crowned heads of Europe that came to pay their respects to the Pope, and he received them in the hall at the western end, so that if they entered under the dome, they would be walking this immense distance until they got to him, parading among these beds. A spectacle for each other.
Oh.
That practice in Rome lasted at least until the 1600s because it's documented. I found documents as well, whereby popes would come to hospitals or visiting dignitaries and parade with the retinue. So one of the reasons I believe that they had these long, untrammeled halls was to facilitate processions by dignitaries. So you could even better, display your great charity.
They certainly didn't have COVID.
Or they did, but they were like,
Yeah, they didn't know it. So Maggie next, and then Avinoam after that.
Okay,
yeah.
I can unmute. Okay, great. So Lynn, your COVID joke is actually, I wanted to ask a serious question about that. So it was really striking to me to hear Carla and David, both of your talks, which seemed to me in different ways to be talking about questions of power, whether that's sort of overtly state or institutional power. But like David, when you were talking about Foucault's genealogies, I was also thinking about how, you could think in really interesting ways about Foucault's kind of relational notion of power playing out in these places. And I was just wondering, because we're seeing sort of medicine and medical institutions and how we give medical care, how people perceive medical care as a locus of power right now in this time of COVID. I was sort of wondering how either or both of you, how your research on these historical medical projects and social and political projects has affected the way you're viewing what's happening now. And then conversely, if what's happening now with COVID has changed any of the questions that you're asking about these historical projects.
David, did you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Well, the one thing I want to say, that's a great question about, there's a couple of really great things embedded in what you asked. I would say, well, one thing I was thinking about with Carla's last comment about the kind of stature, both physical and symbolic stature of the Santo Spirito in Rome. mean, we tend not to think of them this way, but there was a period in the period that Carla is looking at, but well into the 19th and 20th centuries, when hospitals, having a modern hospital or a hospital that did particular kinds of work or focused on particular population, that was something that cities used to show off their, not just their charity, but also their sophistication, their technology. And like, I don't even mean in the 20th century idea of like a modern hospital, just kind of that these beacons of care. And very often they would have the best architects, you know, no matter which city or kind of culture we're talking about, do that kind of work. So they were ways of exercising this kind of munificence, as well as the status of architecture as this kind of medium of power that allowed people from far, you know, out in the rural areas to kind of come there. And very often there would be like postcards and other bits of advertising about hospitals in the way that, you know, you'd have, I don't know, like the Eiffel Tower, and you'd have the London Eye, and you'd have a great hospital. So they functioned in multiple ways for cities, as well as kind of for civic leaders who wanted to kind of promote care for populations. But in terms of how this either enabled or has enabled me to look at COVID, or how COVID has enabled me to kind of look retrospectively, it's undeniable that the role of the senses, the complete kind of negation of our ability to touch each other socially, and the focus on kind of you know, mucous membranes and nose and mouth, and the fact that we are all covered in masks now, it kind of, I'm not the first person to say that it's very reminiscent of being, I don't know, walking through in the Middle Ages, and kind of this understanding of the world out there as this kind of miasma or kind of infectious zone. And of course, it's made us kind of go inside and become domestic, and think about our relationships to other people. So I've been thinking about the Progetto Ophelia long before sort of COVID became kind of a world-changing kind of piece of our collective history. But now that I'm in it and I see the way that hospitals and clinics and places like the Academy have responded to kind of the current moment in all kinds of ways, you know, that we all carry hand sanitizers around with us, that we give each other these like little elbow bumps, and that we think of hospitals, especially where I'm from in Southern California, as these kind of beleaguered institutions that don't even know how to care for people, not because of you know, well, lack of leadership for one, but also because of kind of the overwhelming state of care right now. So much so that, I mean, I was going to show a photo to you, but some of you might have seen it. Late last year, there was a designer in Chile who was designing hospital beds that can be converted into coffins, because this sense that of the direness of the situation. Now, that is not a design feature that I think any designer really wanted to explore, but they were thinking of expediency, and they were thinking of what to do in this catastrophic situation. So those are the kind of contemporary things that are making me look at something like the Progetto Ophelia, or even the kinds of hospital kind of design that Carla is talking about. And but you know, we walk that fine line, not wanting to read everything through the current moment. But I think in this case, it's hard not to see touches of the familiar in the past, and vice versa.
Carla, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a quick thing. Actually, it was while I was writing my first book on these 300 years when hospitals emerged in Europe, what functions they performed. And I think I wrote that in the introduction about, if nothing else, this is discussing something that is still with us. Of course, it's been a few years, since so-called Obamacare and all of the efforts to repeal it, that it really brings home the difference and how the difference between, say, the national healthcare system in most European countries and in the US has very deep historical roots. And what I realized in looking at how hospitals were developed, in what phases and based on what ideas or ideologies, one thing that I wrote was, if nothing else, it ingrained in Europe the notion that the welfare of the community, the responsibility for that welfare, rests with the state. And that really made me understand so many things. I mean, it has very deep, early Christian, starting from the early medieval period, and then it flourished around 1200 because there were the resources, etc. And it was an opportune political moment. But it has really ingrained that understanding that health is the responsibility of the state, not the individual. And now with COVID, of course, the sheer magnitude of it, I mean, I'm saying nothing new, but the sheer magnitude of the crisis has immediately brought to the fore the differences between the haves and have-nots. I mean, it has magnified the inequalities between those who, say, can afford to get numerous tests or can afford to work from home or can afford, and those who cannot, right? And those who maybe, I mean, there was all this discussion about what happens if I have to go to the hospital, what happens if I don't have insurance in the US. And here, at least, there hasn't been that discussion. So yeah, if you're looking at the history of hospitals, those basic historical differences between whether responsibility rests with the state, that is to say with the community, or with the single individual, have had an enormous impact, I think. That would be all.
Avinoam, maybe someone needs to unmute.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you. Both lectures were so inspiring and they work very well together. I enjoy hearing them and thinking with you together. I have two questions. In a way, Carla already started now with this answer, what I was thinking to go into this direction. If we are thinking of the history of hospital as a global history of hospitals, and especially as you meant, the squinch as coming from the East, you know that I don't have to tell you that the earliest hospitals are actually in front of the eyes of the Crusades when they are coming to the area of the Levant, because at the time of Saladin, we have already Bimaristans, we have hospital in cities, Arab cities, and they are functioning as, exactly as you said, as part of a beneficial project of the caliph or of the governor that want to show the power of him giving better life to the people in the city. So my question, if we try to put the, as you say, the emergence of hospital in Europe and try to put it into a global history, how would you combine the two? And especially, I think, because you also mentioned the space where they are located, the San Spirito, in the specific space in Rome that shows the power, as you say, of the government or the church to create a kind of dominance about the question of health for the community, which is also, I think, in the Islamic world was very interesting to think in this direction. I think that the emergence of the Bimaristan could well be connected to a moment where there was a lot of critical voices about medicine at that time, and there was a fear that it will fall into private hands, into private people that will start their own way of medicine. So do you want to centralize it? So this is one question to Carla. I'm sorry that it's long. The other one is to David. With David, I'm just thinking, because you spoke about the kind of a longue durée also of the building. The building is a kind of an open work of art that's now become to be this hospital, a place where there are apartment building. And I'm just thinking of San Servolo in Venice, a place that started as a cloister, went to be into a lepers hospital, and ended up today as the International University of Venice. So I'm looking at the change of the spaces there. There are a lot of spaces there that are redesigned for and repurposed. And I wonder if you could speak about repurposing of already set building into hospitals. What is happening there in terms of space? Especially, you know, I'm thinking of the idea of a malady as a bed air space. So something about space and air should be there as well. Sorry, that's it.
Carla, why don't you go with yours first?
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I first started looking at hospitals, I mean, more years ago than I care to confess, Bimari stands were one of the first things that was mentioned that came up. And in fact, I have a brief part in my book about when the Europeans went to the Holy Lands in unprecedented numbers. They saw these hospitals, and in particular, I mentioned a Bibaristan that is in Jerusalem, and but that it was made by the Knights Hospitallers. There were also the Knights Hospitallers functioning there. So I attempted to trace briefly that history, but I believe it is certainly no coincidence that the very first hospitals, monumental hospitals, appeared in Europe, in France, at the hands of the Plantagenet king, who was heavily involved with the Crusades. I mean, his brother was Richard Lionheart, etc. So I did have a few plans and tried tracking not exactly the layout or the architecture, but the organization of these massive hospitals.
Thank
so
you.
for a fact, there's that. And I mean, also, we all know that medicine was much more advanced in the East than it was in Europe. So that certainly played a role. But I just tried briefly to highlight it, and then, yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
David?
Yeah, well, with regard to your question about repurposing, and actually this brings us back to something that Maggie was asking about, sort of how the moment that we're in kind of makes us think about or relate to other kinds of spaces. I mean, probably since we're all from different parts of the world, we know that there are in our hometowns or whatever cities we've been living in, places that have been, if not repurposed in the kind of full sense, but at least sort of borrowed or used for the time being as clinics, as places for people now to get their shots if they are getting their shots. But there's this kind of amazing set of global images that we've seen over the past, let's say, almost a year and a half, of airplane hangar-sized spaces or abandoned shopping malls or hotels or high schools or auditoriums of various kinds. Large-scale spaces that were meant to kind of bring people together to enjoy a concert or to go shopping or whatever it happens to be, to get educated, being converted even temporarily into kind of pop-up hospital spaces. But there's a whole other set of interesting spaces that have been created because in many parts of the world, especially in parts of Asia and in Latin America, they've been looking at the repurposing of those containers that you sometimes see stacked up, you know, on ships. So a shipping container often provides kind of a great contained space for patients or for various kinds of medical operations. So there's a lot of creativity, but also creativity born out of frustration, desperation, and the need to kind of do things on the fly that people have been turning to. As far as looking at historical models, there's such a rich literature on the conversion of different kinds of, like a private estate into a state or national hospital or asylum of some kind. There's lots of those. Private estates either become like liberal arts colleges or they become hospitals or asylums of some kind. At least in the U.S., that's very typical, and places like the UK as well. So those places get repurposed, and they obviously maintain the architecture and the gardens and so forth, but they get redone. The long corridor of like an estate, like in the English countryside, makes a great hospital, especially if what you want are rooms that can be closed off and kind of making places as sort of antiseptic and hermetically sealed as possible. So there's a really interesting history to be written about the repurposing of spaces over time, and then the ways in which COVID has encouraged new designs or new repurposing of spaces, as I say, less out of just improvisation and creativity and more out of a kind of desperate need to create neutral spaces for populations who need care.
I think they did that in Downton Abbey.
Exactly. Downton Abbey, always a good go-to when talking about hospital design.
So we're just past 7:30. There are a couple more questions, but I think we should probably wrap it up now. And I just want to thank David and Carla and say that they've set the bar pretty high for the rest of you. You're going to have to aim pretty high to catch them. So thank you both for such a wonderful start to our Shop Talks.
Grazie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Thanks,
Good night.
Leah. Good night.